Welcome to memoQ Talks, where we talk to industry leaders about their experiences, lessons learned, and what works best across all areas of localization. Now here's your host.
Hey, guys. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks. How are you?
Awesome. Hey, it was good to see you out here for memoQ Day Seattle. That was a pretty good event, wasn't it?
It was great to be there. And I was super excited about the participants. But after the event, I was super impressed by the feedback as well. And I'm very happy about how we managed everything and how everybody enjoyed the event.
No, it was great. It was a really nice event. And I do want to say congratulations to you on the air. I mean, you've had like a couple of promotions in the last year. You went from your role as a business development manager to the hub leader, which for people outside of memoQ, hub means our region. So you were the regional sales leader for North America, South America, or the Americas. And then very shortly after that, you were promoted to Chief Revenue Officer globally for memoQ. So congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you very much.
How are you liking it?
It's very different.
It's very different. Okay. Well, what I want to talk to you about is the differences going from a salesperson to a sales leader. And I want to talk to you, about what types of qualities and activities it takes to be an effective sales leader. But before we get into that, I actually would just like to, take a step back and ask you, you've done a variety of sales jobs, even, including memoQ, but before memoQ. Why do you like selling?
I think I personally enjoy listening to people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm good at observing things. I consider myself to be a good listener. I think that's one of the prerequisites of being in sales. We oftentimes confuse things by saying you have to be really good at talking and you should talk a lot and you should be an extrovert to be in sales. But I believe more and more so the information is so easy to access now for our customers, essentially. We need to do more listening, and we need to be more observant of the market, of what our customers need, and asking the right questions. I think that's especially in B2B selling. I think that's pretty important, and I really enjoy doing that. I think for me, identifying the problems that customers are struggling with, and then providing a solution that works for them, that gives me the thrill, you could say. And even now that I'm in a leadership position, every now and then I would jump myself into some sales calls because I miss it sometimes.
No, it's funny because it makes you sound like a very, very nice person because one, you like to listen and you like to ask questions and help people or companies solve their problems, which is kind of the opposite impression that a lot of non-sales people have of salespeople, where they're like, oh, these guys are going to show up and talk a lot and slap us on our back and try to be our friends and go like, hey, buy this. And that might work in certain scenarios, but when it comes to selling enterprise software, I think you just hit the nail on the head there, that you got to ask really smart questions and then be an effective listener. And sometimes customers are trying to figure stuff out, and they might not even know what questions to ask, and you can kind of guide them, I guess.
Absolutely. A lot of times I tell my team, we have to guide the customer towards identifying what they really need. It may come out of the conversation that they don't really need our software at all. It's entirely possible. But we also don't want to sell something that the customer doesn't need. One of the reasons why memoQ has a really low churn rate is because of that approach. We really identify the key problems that the customer has, and we are able to identify how memoQ can help them. And in some cases, memoQ is not the answer, and that's up to the customer to decide what they would do. But that's for me, it's pretty important for us to be able to identify and guide the customer in that direction as to if they are not able to ask the right questions, you have to steer the conversation in a direction where they're able to have that epiphany during the conversation. Oh yeah, I didn't think about that. That's exactly what I was trying to resolve. And having that conversation is really what should make you a successful salesperson.
I totally agree. It's funny, sometimes a customer I've seen might ask, oh, do you have this feature or this capability? And really what you can respond to is, yes, we have it. No, we don't. Or you could say, we possibly do. Could you explain to us why you need that or how you would use it? Because sometimes they're not really looking for the specific feature. They're looking to get something done or to solve some problem. And there may be several other ways to solve that problem besides that quote unquote, feature that they have in their mind.
I agree. And I think we have to understand that's what they're looking for right now, especially with information being so easily available online. We do not want to give them and just quote a brochure and just go through it, right? Everything is available online. They want to use our expertise. memoQ, for example, has been in the industry since 2004. So this 20 years of experience, so working with a variety of customers, the prospect that I'm talking to, they would like to dive into that experience and identify, okay, what have you learned in these 20 years working with so many other customers? How do you think we could resolve these specific issues? That's where our consultative selling comes into picture. It's not about quoting what features we have, what we don't have, as you said. It's about identifying why they need those specific features. And from our experience of working with hundreds of other customers, how this feature has helped them and potentially guiding them as to how it could help this specific prospect as well.
No, that's awesome. And I've seen you in action and several of our other memoQ sales colleagues in action, and everybody is really good at asking those questions. It's kind of funny though. A lot of SaaS or software as a service sales conversations will typically start off like, oh, you book a demo and then you show up, and then the salesperson will spend 20, 30 minutes asking questions, but they're more on qualifying questions, which is really annoying if you're in the buying position, because you just want to get the problem solved and you want to see, can this do it? And what I've seen with, I guess my point is there's two types of questions. What I've seen with you and some of our other colleagues is that you're asking insightful questions to really get an understanding of what they're trying to accomplish. So that's huge.
Yeah, and again, that's the customer-centric approach, and that's where it stems from.
Well, let me ask you, in addition to being a good listener, asking smart questions, and helping customers solve their real problems, understand what those problems are, and then solve them, what are some other key attributes for successful salespeople?
One of the key attributes, I would say, is being able to connect with a person on a human level. Mm-hmm. A lot of times we might fall into this trap of being too focused on business side of things and not understanding that the person on the other side is also a human. And mm-hmm. This is just a conversation two people are having. To be able to identify that balance and steer the conversation in a direction which feels more natural. I think that would be... for me, I would feel very comfortable talking to a salesperson who has that capability of maintaining that balance of having that business conversation, but also understanding that we are just two humans talking.
I agree with you on that. And I always say that trust is a huge part of the buying process, but a big part of trust is, are you sincerely demonstrating that you're sincerely interested in the customer's needs and requirements by asking questions and being a good listener, but also in terms of connecting with them. If you seem kind of aloof or distant and cold, it's tough to have that connection. And sometimes you don't have to connect exactly on the business conversation. Maybe you have some kind of common interest or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it should feel very natural. That's the goal that you should have in mind. It shouldn't feel forced, or you shouldn't have like a script that you're following with every single person you speak to. The conversation should have some sort of natural flow to it.
Exactly. Hey, so now let's get on to the topic of sales leadership, sales management, which are kind of the same thing, but kind of different. But I want to frame this question with the thought that traditionally, a lot of organizations, they would take their top performing salesperson and say, oh, this will be our great next sales leader. And sometimes the qualities of your top performing salesperson might be a little bit different from somebody who's in a leadership position. So let me ask you, what are you identified some of the key traits of a salesperson. What do you think are the key traits of a sales leader?
Oh, well, this is a really good question. And for me, since I've been in both positions, I can tell you there's a huge difference between the two. And um, yes, it's good to have a sales leader who has a good track record of selling and has been successful in selling, but it's not necessarily always a prerequisite. I think one of the key elements that a leader should have is being able to identify a direction for the team, having that vision that while the team is selling, having that long term vision in mind as to, okay, we are providing an environment for the sales team in which they can sell. But what is the end goal? The leadership has to provide that environment where they are able to attain that end goal. And I think in memoQ's specific scenario, I think it's completely different than what I've had experienced previously. I think being in a leadership position where your entire team is 100% remote, in various other time zones, speaking different languages, coming from various other cultures, I think there is a lot more to take into account. Cultural differences, for example. A lot of times, if you are a sales leader, you cannot assume what you think is the right way to do things necessarily applies to someone who's born and bred in Japan or Korea or China. It's completely different, and it's not something that it will be nice that if you know the differences. I think it's a requirement that a leader should learn the differences, and being able to manage a team where you take into account those cultural differences is pretty important. If you tell someone in China how to sell, but you're very American, I'm not sure if it would work. So you have to be able to educate yourself on these differences. And I think that's, for me, is much more important than having a track record of selling maybe in Canada or the US.
No, it totally makes sense. And I've seen that as well. Sometimes you have to walk a fine line between, if you're in a multinational corporation, in terms of your company's best practices versus local practices. And you picked out a couple of really good examples there of, Japan, Korea, China. But let me ask you this. Do you see any cultural differences between how North Americans approach a sales scenario versus Europeans?
Oh yeah. There is a difference, and it's not just in terms of how you're selling, but how people work in general. I find it there's a huge difference. I don't know if you've heard about these cultural dimensions that leaders always talk about, right? So they measure these metrics across different countries. Things like power distance index and all of these things. Sometimes you might find these kinds of information that it's not really relevant. But if you are managing teams across so many different cultures, Europe and North America, for example, a lot of things are different. I mean, if let's take an example of one of the things that I look at this index is how easy it is for you to take risks, for example. Right. And if you look at people in Denmark and Portugal, they're not on the same side. There's a difference even in Europe. I'm talking about just in Europe. So going to North America and comparing that, it's entirely different. But even in Europe, you'll find people within different countries have different take on whether they would like to take more risks. And just to elaborate on that, the Singapore and Denmark specifically, they have a higher tolerance for risk. They are more risk takers. They're more innovative in that regard. Portugal, on the other hand, would like to have a more clearly defined structure, a more comprehensive program under which they would like to work. And if you're not able to identify these small details, you would be, as a leader, in a position where you would just think that everything is pretty uniform across the company, and whatever I say to someone in Portugal should obviously apply to someone in Denmark, right? But that's not really the case. You really have to educate yourself as to what would work in every specific market. And if you're a leader, it's your job to do it. That's what makes you a good leader. You are able to identify that. People working in those regions probably would not care about looking at those indexes and talking to people and understanding why these cultural differences matter. But as a leader, it's your job to educate yourself and also educate the team. Because on the other hand, if you're talking to customers who are from different cultures, it might come into account as well. And you have to make sure that the team understands. Even internally, it's not just about sales. For me, when I talk to people in my team, even in North America, we have people from different cultures. We have, I can't even, I think everybody's from a different country. We have people from Argentina, from Egypt. And this cultural difference is quite visible for me in my small team in North America as well. And talking about the global team, it's entirely different.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. There's so many things I could comment on. I kind of feel like when in Rome, do as Romans. So I don't care really where you're from, because I don't think we can make cultural allowances for every single person in every scenario. Because at the end of the day, we've got too many different exceptions going on. I think we need to be on the same page. And if we're selling in, for example, North America, I think that the overriding thing should be focused on, what works in North America. And if we're selling in Japan, for example, I don't care what country you're from, but if you're in Japan, it's a high context, which is one of the phrases from the books that you referenced. It's a high context, high touch society. And, you need to go meet the customers face to face, and you need to give them documentation in Japanese, and you need to show them the complete plan from A to Z so that they feel comfortable. And it seems like a lot of work on the front end, but they're very risk averse. So they want that work on the front end. But once you do the deal's it just goes, and it's really nice, right? But I lived in Japan for 5 years, and I couldn't say like, well, hey, I'm American, so you got to make exceptions because I'm American. No, I can be myself, but I have to meet them, on their court and on their playing field, and act in a way that's appropriate or what's acceptable to them. So totally agree, and it's this kind of I don't know, juggling match of just trying to figure out what's the most appropriate. Let me go back to the some of the other characteristics of effective sales leaders, because if you look at high performing salespeople, oftentimes they're motivated by they want the money, so all these accounts are mine. I want all the accounts, and then whenever a deal is closed, people want credit. Oh, look at me, I got this deal, right? And they expect other people to help them, get the resources they need to close a deal. Whereas if you're a sales leader, you can't be hogging all the accounts. You can't be taking all the credit. And you've got to go out and find resources for your team. For example, I just mentioned the Japanese collateral for Japan market, and I'm sure that's not the only market where you need those collaterals. So how do you deal with that? Because you're a sales leader. I'm not talking about you specifically. I'm just talking about sales leaders in general. You're still a human being. You still want to make money. You still want to get that recognition, right? And you want the team to kind of be enabled to get their own resources, but you've got to go do that. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a challenge, to say the least. And most of the times, what I like to do is I like to build rapport internally in the company. I like to what I've done so far in sales with customers, I also like to do internally with everybody else in the company, and building that human connection and building that business relationship and finding that balance between the two. And as long as I'm able to build a strong business case for everything I need, I haven't had much issues with anything, to be honest. And that's what I think. I also tell my team a lot of times that whenever you need something, whenever you have a roadblock, as long as we can create a good business case for it, I can get things done, regardless of how difficult it would be. But we sometimes have a lot of items in our wish list, right? We need a lot of resources. We need a lot of things to be successful. That's what we say. But I like to believe that as long as there is a strong business case for any of those things, it should make sense for everybody in the company. That yes, it's definitely something that we need. And for me as a leader, my job is to formulate all those things together and build that business case so that it makes sense, not just for the sales team, but for the entire company. And that's when everybody will pull their resources to make sure that the sales team is successful in doing that. And I think that's what sales leaders should do. And I think that's what makes them leaders.
I agree with you. I mean, there's so many additional elements to that role, which makes it, as you said earlier, quote unquote, interesting. But let me ask you, because if you're a sales leader, part of your, you got to have a coaching hat where you're coaching and helping people improve, or helping them to solve a particular customer issue or scenario, or helping them to close a deal. You have a managing aspect where you're like, hey, Mugais, I'm looking at your numbers here and I have some questions, right? And then you have this, which could be similar to the coaching hat. You've got this motivational hat, like, hey guys, this is a great opportunity. We're at a great time. The market, so on and so forth, just to get the team energized and motivated. How do you juggle those three different hats? And maybe you can talk about your thoughts in terms of how you accomplish those.
Very good question, and I think very relevant for me in my role. I like to compartmentalize everything in my mind, and I use a lot of tools for that personally to manage that. Sometimes when I'm talking to a particular member of my team, they're in a one-on-one conversation with me, and for them, this is the entire world. For me, right? I'm talking to the CRO, and I'm talking to him, presenting my case. He's thinking about it, probably providing a solution. But in my mind, I have 40 other people that I'm also talking to in a similar one-on-one situation. So I have to be able to compartmentalize everything. And those three different aspects that you mentioned, it's about timing. When is the right time to have that motivational talk? When is the right time to do coaching? And to be able to find that balance with every specific individual. And I have created a system for me personally where I've compartmentalized everything and created routines with my team. It's not 100% there, and I'm still, I would say, building that system for me. Again, one of the other things that I also have to manage is different time zones, and that also helps when I'm trying to compartmentalize everything. I also have to take into account what part of my day is going to be associated with what region, and then right. In that region, who I will be talking to and what kind of conversation will I be having. So all of these things have to have a structure. If I'm not building that structure, it will be really haphazard, and I don't think it will have a really good outcome. And this is really the first thing that I built for myself, a system where I can compartmentalize everything and have sort of a routine and identify when is the right time to have what kind of conversation. And all of these items that you mentioned are a part of a sales leadership role, right? To be able to motivate the team, to be able to coach the team, providing incentives for the team, and just making sure every individual you're talking to, they feel that they're involved in those conversations. You have to also understand that if I'm in Canada and I have to talk to someone from Japan, it's entirely different from if I have to talk to someone in the US. I can just pick up the phone and I can just call the person, right? It's not the same for my team in Asia. So again, if I don't have a system in place, it will be nearly impossible to manage.
Makes a lot of sense. And wow, I can't imagine having all those conversations and all those time zones. Back in the day when I was in regional roles, typically, I mean, we would have weekly check-ins, but then I would go and visit to each office, and we would go out and do customer visits. But I'm thinking today's world, so many of the customer interactions are remote. So it wouldn't matter if you flew out to different locations if you're just you know what I mean? Because then you're just going to do a Zoom call. So it's just an interesting, different dynamic. But speaking of customer interactions, how do you allow your team to feel comfortable that you're there on a joint call with a prospect? In terms of, one, there's always some kind of potentially performance anxiety. There's also the fact that, some sales leaders, they'll want to take a leadership role in that call because, hey, I'm the leader. And some salespeople are open to that. Some people would say, hey, my manager's here. Why don't you have the conversation with them? But sometimes there are language issues, and some salespeople, they want to run the call and only have you talk when you need to speak. So how do you balance all that?
I personally avoid being on customer calls unless I can add some value right there and then. What I mean by that, if there is a moment in the interaction with the customer in terms of our sales cycle where I have to make decisions right on spot, that's when I would like to be involved in the call. It just shortens the sales cycle. If my salesperson is on call with the customer and there's a situation where they feel like if I don't involve the CRO, I would have to end the call and tell them, hey, let me get back to you on this. I'll talk to my manager and find out what we can do. I would like to avoid the situation. I would like to be on the call and just give them a decision right there so we can move forward faster. And in those situations, I would still prefer that the salesperson takes control of the conversation, does what they do. And I understand there will be some sort of anxiety in that conversation. But what I do to make the salesperson feel comfortable is I'm there only for one part of the call, which is to make a decision right there so we can move faster.
It makes a lot of sense. I guess one of the most important things you can do as a sales leader or sales manager is to hire the right people. And I found that hiring, I don't care for what position, it's super important. You want to get that right. Hiring good salespeople for me can be particularly challenging, or has been particularly challenging, because people often interview really, really well, and then they get on the job, and the performance, your performance may vary, as they say. So, what's your heuristic for hiring the right people?
It's pretty challenging because if you're a good salesperson, you should be able to sell yourself very, very well in interviews, right? So if you're able to sell yourself well, that's a good sign that, okay, you're good at sales, but are you really what you're saying you are, right? So it's really difficult to tap into that. But for me, I have some sort of KPIs that I look into when I'm hiring people. One of the things is I think to understand how the person is in terms of their career progression, what is the reason they want to be involved in sales for, let's say at memoQ, for example. And what motivates them to be a salesperson at memoQ? I think anyone I interview for a sales position, they have had a variety of experiences in selling, and they will most of the time they're excellent salespeople. But for me, what I'm trying to see is how they fit into what I'm trying to resolve internally, and if they're able to answer that question for me when I present that scenario. If I am satisfied by the response on what value they can bring in our specific scenario, that's really what I could say is the right person for me, because that's really a tailored solution that they're creating for memoQ. And that's my answer to this.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Incentives. Well, actually, let me back up. I want to talk about targets, because as a leader or as a manager, you probably have some targets for your team or for individuals, and those targets can be financial or they can be activity based. Maybe some other things there. What are your thoughts on the appropriate way to structure targets for individual salespeople and or teams?
Yeah, I firmly believe we should have targets for individuals and teams. I think if you don't know what your goal is, you're never going to get there. It's pretty simple. So everybody should have an aim and target that they are chasing. And for me, this is something that I've since I took over, I'm taking this pretty serious. I'm trying to benchmark the numbers that I'm providing for the sales team. What I mean by that is, for people working in different regions, it's not a good idea to have like a uniform target for everybody in every region, in every different kind of an economic environment. So we really have to be able to identify and benchmark those numbers against the region that the person is working in, against the industry standards, against the market, against the SaaS industry in general. The reason for that also is the salespeople should not feel discouraged by the targets. It should motivate them. It should challenge them. It should motivate them. It should make them a little nervous, but also excited. And that's the balance we need to find. And also the reason why I think benchmarking is important is to make the salespeople understand that these targets are based on data and it's fair. And I know it will always be ambitious. It's our job to make sure that the targets are ambitious for the salespeople. But for me, benchmarking is pretty important. And I think that's something that the salespeople encourage, and they also appreciate it. because when there is a thought behind every decision we make, and as long as that thought has, again, a business case for it, I generally find that the team appreciates it and feels motivated to be part of that structure.
And are your targets revenue based only, or do you have activity targets as well?
No, it's not just revenue. There are a lot of other KPIs that are monitored. And again, this is based on your specific role. So when I say sales team, generally we think about people at the forefront, whether it's BDRs or business development managers. But there's also other sides to sales, the customer success managers, the technical people that are involved in assisting the BDMs. So there are different KPIs for everybody that we monitor. And I think that you can always have a quantitative side, but you should also have a little bit of a qualitative side in terms of your targets. And finding that balance is pretty important. I do believe that the most important aspect for people at the forefront, the BDRs or the BDMs, is the customer acquisition, the revenue goals. But if you have a KPI associated with those targets, I think those are all linked together. And if you're good at your KPIs, but you still don't have good results, I think you can have a better conversation and a better coaching in place for those people. And if someone is not able to meet their targets, aside of the revenue targets, that gives you an indication as to what kind of training or coaching the person needs, and where the person would potentially need more help to be able to achieve those targets.
Excellent. What are your thoughts in terms of how you structure incentives, team versus individual, etc.?
We have kind of experimented with a lot at memoQ. We've had team targets, and I personally believe there should be individual targets for salespeople. And there are different dynamics. You can completely change the sales culture depending on how you're setting these targets and goals for the team. As you can see, if you have like a collaborative environment where you have a team goal, a group target, for example, you would see higher collaboration in teams. But if you have individual targets, that's the classic way to do it. Maybe that collaboration will not be at that high a level. But to resolve this, you could have a balance where individuals have their targets, but you have KPIs linked with the team goals. You have KPIs linked with company goals. I think OKRs is one of the ways you can resolve this issue, where you have company-wide goals, and everybody, whatever they are doing, is towards that common goal that the company has set. And I think that creates a good balance of having that collaborative environment, but everybody also has a target that they're chasing.
Makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I would totally agree with you that, selling a enterprise software solution it's a team sport. There's no lone wolf salesperson that's going to go out there and generate leads, engage with the customer, do the demos, close the deal without the assistance of a solution engineer or a customer success manager. And then, and even at when you do close the deal, you do need to do the onboarding and the training and everything like that. And you will need maybe your business services team to come in and talk about potential integrations and so on. So it's a complex selling environment, and it's a team sport. And so it's nice that you can have both individual incentives for every person on that team, or the key people in the team, and then also some type of group KPI or incentive as well. Yeah. What do you, as a sales leader, how do you structure training? Do you do group training, or do you look at individuals and see what they need and set up, time for you to help them, or bring in external trainers? How does that work?
It's a bit of everything. We need to have trainings based on roles. I think those kind of groups need to be together. I think the exchange of ideas amongst colleagues is pretty important. I like to have that kind of training where there's a group of individuals in the same kind of role. And then there are trainings for individuals wherever needed. I think I personally, in my team, if I identify a specific individual with a really high potential but needs some sort of help, that's where I would involve them in a one-on-one training. But most of the time, I think having trainings with a similar group of people who are in a similar role, where you can have exchange of ideas, is for me the best approach. External involvement, I think it's important to have some sort of external involvement. A lot of times in companies we like to live in our own bubble and we think we have all the answers. But when you try to challenge yourself, you might surprise yourself a lot of times. And I personally, as a leader, like to be challenged a lot. I prefer that my team, my colleagues, the leadership team at memoQ, I like to be challenged on my decisions, and I encourage it because that gives me a reason to think about what I'm doing. And if I am able to validate my thoughts after being challenged as well, then I know for sure that I'm taking the right decisions. And involving people externally is a good way to do that as well. If you're making a big change in your organization, for example, at that point, it's pretty important to have some sort of external involvement to check whether or not you're taking the right direction in terms of the market in general, in terms of the industry in general, right? So in those scenarios, I think it's good to have some sort of involvement. It's not necessary that you always take into account everything that comes externally, but you're able to challenge your decisions. You're able to challenge the direction that you're going in. And that again is all about exchange of ideas. And when you have people inside the company who are fully capable, sometimes it becomes difficult to find good reason to involve people externally. But I personally believe that we should have people from outside just challenging us.
Yeah, makes sense. I do like the idea of sharing of ideas, because if training is done top down or one to many, sometimes, I mean, it's basically one person's view and one person's experience, and that person might be a genius, and it could be very helpful. But oftentimes I've seen where if you take the collective audience or the collective participants, they all bring so much information about and knowledge about the market and what's working and what's not working and success stories. And when you can create an environment where people are, explaining their challenges and then asking for, recommendations on from their teammates, how to overcome those challenges, or when they share success stories, those are both educational and motivational. Super, super helpful. But once in a while, you do need to have somebody from the outside come in and shake things up, because otherwise you can have this like echo chamber of like, hey, this is what we do. And, this is how we do it. So that's really good. But so then, now we're talking about training for salespeople. What about for sales leaders? I bet you, if I went onto Amazon and looked for sales books, there's probably, my guess is there's several 100,000. Okay, and maybe 100 of them are widely used or widely read. But if you looked specifically for books for sales leaders, my guess that there would be less than 3% of the books written are for actual sales leaders. So where do you go, and where should other sales leaders go to learn how to become better at their job?
Yes, I think in this scenario, I encourage creativity first. I think people should have their own ideas to start with. A lot of times, if you're only relying on books and the information that's out there, it should be in a balanced way where you don't entirely follow the structures and the leadership style that's been advertised in those business books. The balance has to be between creativity and also what works. And a lot of people who have written those books have had decades of experience of leadership, and they've learned a lot. It's very important to take that into account. But I also like to have that aspect of creativity because in today's world, by the time his book is published, I'm sure the market has changed entirely. So right now, I'm looking at things changing every day. And a book that was published in maybe 2022, it's good to have that into account in your leadership style, but it's also important to make sure that you're actively being creative about the changing environment in the world and not following the traditional ways that have worked always so far, but may not work in the current scenario. And I think that's where you have to find the balance. For me, I believe that successful leaders who have written those books add a lot of value. And I think I encourage leaders to read them. But I also, at the same time, encourage leaders to be more creative and be in a position
when you
where...
say creative, what does that mean? I mean, give me an example.
Creative in the sense that in the changing world, it's changing market, right? So if you use ideas that were meant for, let's say, 2022, and you're in 2024 right now, and the market is changing so rapidly, you have companies coming up with new AI solutions every week, right? You have to be able to adapt to that, and you will have questions from your team on how we can sell in an environment when there are other companies coming up with so many new solutions every day, right? So to be able to leverage what you've learned from those leadership books, let's say, and to be able to be creative in an environment that's changing so rapidly, which may not have been the case when those books were published necessarily.
No, it makes sense. Again, though, I think a lot of the books are written with kind of a principles approach. Like, if you're going to be a good leader, these are the things that you should do. In my experience, a lot of those things are not so time bound. It's kind of like, how to win friends and influence people. Those kind of principles last for hopefully longer than the publishing cycle of the book. But I think and I may be wrong here, but I think what you're specifically drawing out is the technological landscape is changing really, really quickly, as is the competitive landscape. Okay. So I'd like to talk about those two things because, if we look at sales enablement tools, the tools that are available to teams these days are, incredibly powerful. And we're not even on the landscape, or not even on the horizon, I should say, a few years ago. Things like, Kong AI and, and all the different prospecting tools and so on. So what are your thoughts in terms of the sales enablement tools that you're impressed with?
I think as a leader, you have to be aware of what's out there and what can benefit your team. And if you're able to find gaps in your current team structure, that's when you can identify what tools will be the best fit for your team. One approach is just to experiment, just bring in these new tools and see what happens. But I think it's more important to identify the gaps and what kind of solution can resolve those gaps. And I think when I spoke about creativity and the book that you mentioned, I think that's more on the self-help side, and that's more on psychology. I think human psychology is timeless. I don't think that changes at all. And if you're talking about leadership books specifically on human psychology, I agree, it's timeless. But I'm specifically talking about the question that you just asked, right? About the tools that are out there. Right, you could have. I can identify leadership books that probably encouraged mastering Excel. Right, we'll still have some of those books around, but those are outdated. Right, we need to be able to, as a leader, be creative.
I've still never mastered Excel, but but I'm glad they're outdated because I don't need to master it anymore.
I'm sure there are books that have recommended that. Right, as a leader, you need to be able to do that, but that cannot be timeless. That kind of information is definitely outdated. And for us as leaders, we have to be ahead of our team. When the team is selling, they're not going to go out there and research what makes a better team structure, right? What kind of tools can benefit them. And if I'm able to have that vision and identify what would make the lives easier for my team, what would make selling easier for them, if we can remove barriers from their day-to-day tasks, anything that's repetitive, if we can remove that with one of these tools, that's what we should be able to identify as leaders.
Awesome. And yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I'm curious. So earlier we touched on part of the job as a leader is to kind of motivate the team. I personally believe that salespeople, everybody should be self-motivated. I don't think it's my job to be a cheerleader. That said, we're all human beings, and we all have our down times, and sometimes we can just use a pat on the back, or somebody to say, hey, you're doing a great job, that kind of thing. I don't think anybody is oblivious to that, and I think it's helpful for everybody in the right time, in the right place. So it's nice to be help motivate your team. How do you get motivated?
By seeing results, by watching the team go in a direction that I had envisioned, by watching the team buying into my vision. And that's, for me, the primary source of motivation. When I see that everybody is buying into the vision and working hard to bringing everything to reality, That's, for me, that's very fulfilling.
Well, that's awesome. And from what I've seen with the team, they are doing a great job. So you must be pretty darn motivated, which means that you're doing a great job as well. Hey, guys, I think this is the second time you've been on memoQ Talks.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming on here, and thank you for the work you do. And look forward to crossing paths with you, if not at one of the industry events, maybe at one of our own events, maybe next year out here in Seattle again.
Yeah, thank you. Always nice talking to you.
Thank you for joining memoQ Talks, where we talked with industry leaders about their experiences and lessons learned to gain new insights about what works best across all areas of localization. Join us next time on memoQ Talks.